look forward to getting mine every month.
Okay.
I just started mine.
Dude, me too. We're synced.
You still get it, Grandma?
Sure do.
It's so heavy. I cried. It's happening again.
I'd invite you up, but I just got my book of the month.
Book of the month. Choose from 5 new books and get your favorite delivered to you monthly.
Stunning video templates. Each video maker is carefully designed to look professional. Our video makers are super easy to use and let anyone with an internet connection create high quality videos in seconds. Edit logos, mockups, videos, and design templates with just a few clicks. Each template is carefully made by design experts, so your work will always look great. Get started with the best video maker at Placie.net.
Snacks and fruit. She made a cheese sandwich and wrapped it in cling film. It was all very Little Red Riding Hood. Won't it get eaten by animals? I said. She stared at the basket. You're right. I need something more secure, like a metal box with a key. I don't have anything like that. Julia, do you really think Lily could be living wild in the woods? She laid her hands flat on the counter, as if stopping herself from falling. If there's a chance, even the remotest chance, Ursula was lying. I don't know why, but I was not lying. I whirled around. Ursula stood in the kitchen doorway. She still wore her red coat, even though it was warm in the house. Maybe she was one of those people who's always cold. Thin skin, weak blood. Anger bubbled up in me, and I was about to give her a piece of my mind when she produced a mobile phone, one of those large iPhones, and said, "Look, I took a picture. You didn't give me a chance to show it to you." Julia began trembling as Ursula unlocked the phone and located the Photos app. "There. See?" I couldn't believe it. But there it was. A picture of the edge of the woods where Julia and I had just stood. And in front of the trees, facing the camera, was a child. "I'm afraid it's not very clear," Ursula said, as Julia took the phone from her and zoomed in on the figure. It was a girl with long brown hair. She was wearing a blue coat and jeans. "Is it—" I could hardly bring myself to say it. "Is it Lily? I can't tell. I want it to be her so much that I'm seeing her, but I don't know. I don't know." "Let's plug it into a computer," I said. "Make it bigger." I ran upstairs and grabbed my laptop, along with the USB cable I used to charge my missing phone. Back in the kitchen, I plugged Ursula's phone in and navigated through a series of permissions messages. Finally, I was able to import the photo. It appeared full size on the screen. It was a top-of-the-range laptop with a retina screen, so the photo appeared bright and vivid. It was a little out of focus, but we were able to zoom in on the girl's face so her features were visible enough to identify her. "It's not Lily," Julia said, the disappointment making her voice tremble. I put my hand on her shoulder, which drew a knowing look from Ursula. "But I know her," Julia said, staring at the picture. "It's Lily's friend, Megan. Her family lives on the other side of the woods." She grabbed her car keys from the hook on the wall. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To talk to her. I want to know what she was doing." She left the kitchen, then turned back. "Come on, bring your laptop." "Do you feel bad now?" Julia asked as she drove onto the main road. "About accusing Ursula of lying?" "A bit. I still think she's dangerous, though." She laughed. She seemed a little giddy. "You don't get on with many people, do you?" "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, just that I know you don't like Max, and you've taken an instant dislike to Ursula. Also, I read an interview with you online and you were doing the whole Greta Garbo I want to be alone thing." I don't think my ironic sense of humour comes across in interviews. I paused. "Wait, you were reading an interview with me?" Did I imagine it, or did she go a very pale shade of pink? I like to keep up with what my guests are up to." "Right." Neither of us could think what to say. Eventually Julia said, "You must think I'm losing it, after what happened earlier." "Of course I don't. It's totally understandable." "It was a bit bonkers, though, wasn't it? My plan to leave a picnic in the woods." We headed west, skirting the edge of the woods. This was close to where I'd found the creepy hut and had been picked up by that gossiping taxi driver. We were driving in a loop, so it was a lot further by car than it would be on foot. "Here we are." Julia pulled into a little housing estate comprising 20 or 30 houses which looked like they'd been built in the last decade or so. Neat square lawns, wide pavements, trampolines in half the gardens. An estate designed for young families. Julia pulled up outside number 22, which was one of the largest houses, positioned in front of the woods that stretched all the way to the retreat. Julia rang the doorbell. "Hi, Wendy," she said to the woman who answered the door. She was in her late 30s, slim and wearing a slogan T-shirt. A black Labrador was trying to get past her. She grabbed its collar and held it back. "Julia, this is, a surprise?" She gave me a quizzical look, eyes dropping to the laptop under my arm, then invited us in, saying, "Get down, Barney," to the dog, which leapt about trying to give both Julia and me a hug. Wendy finally shut Barney in the kitchen and invited us into the living room. "Is Megan around?" Julia asked. "She's in her bedroom. Is everything all right?" She kept glancing at me, clearly trying to figure out who I was. "I wanted to ask her something." Wendy gave Julia a curious look, then gestured for us to take a seat, though neither of us sat down. Wendy left the room, calling Megan's name up the stairs. Getting no reply, she went up, her footsteps echoing behind her. Julia paced the room, chewing her thumbnail, giving off waves of nervous energy. I examined the framed pictures on the mantelpiece. Wendy had 2 kids, Megan and an older son. Next, I examined the bookcase, something I do whenever I visit someone's house. I can't help it. If I enter a house with no books, it makes me uneasy. I wonder what's wrong with the people who live there. I was drawn past the paperback bestsellers to a book I recognised, Folk Tales and Urban Myths. I'd seen this book recently, but where? I took it down and flicked through it. It was a kid's book, full of stories about legends like Bloody Mary and the Beast of Bodmin Moor. It went back further, describing how communities would live in terror of witches and werewolves, night demons and weeping women. The illustrations were vivid and creepy. "Lily's got that book," Julia said. "I've no idea where it came from. She just brought it home one day." That was where I'd seen it. Lily's bedroom. I replaced the book on the shelf as Wendy came back into the room, followed by the girl from Ursula's photograph. "Hi, Megan," Julia said. "Hi, Mrs. Marsh." The girl fidgeted awkwardly, sucking on a strand of hair. She perched on the edge of the sofa, both legs jiggling up and down, as if her body couldn't contain all its energy. She couldn't make eye contact with Julia. "How are you?" Megan shrugged. "Good, thanks." "Were you outside my house earlier?" Julia asked. Megan dipped her chin and didn't answer. She stared at a stain on the carpet as if it might contain the answer to the meaning of life. Finally, after her mum said her name, Megan said, "Yeah." "What were you doing there?" Megan stuck out her bottom lip. "Just looking." "At the house?" She nodded, and then the lip she'd been sticking out trembled. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. It's just, sometimes I miss Lily. I like looking at your house and remembering." "Oh, sweetheart," Julia said. Wendy swooped in and folded her daughter up in her arms. "You were upsetting her," she said to Julia. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. I thought... It's stupid, but I had this idea that Megan might know something." "About Lily?" Wendy shook her head. "It was 2 years ago. I thought maybe she knew something and was coming to tell me." "What's going on?" A male voice came from the doorway. "Grandad!" Megan extricated herself from her mum's arms and leapt across to the man who'd entered the room, flinging her arms around him. He was completely bald and in his 60s. "What's the matter, Angel?" he asked Megan. Before Megan could reply, Wendy told him what had happened. "There's no law against her going into the woods, is there?" he said. His teeth pointed in half a dozen directions. I did a double-take. He stared back at me with evident hostility. Was this the man Zara had encountered at the chess club? "We're all very sorry about what happened, Mrs. Marsh," the bald man said, "but that doesn't mean you can come here, upsetting my granddaughter." I didn't like his hostile tone. "With respect," I said, "Julia was upset when she saw Megan." "And you are—" "Lucas Radcliffe," I replied. "He's a writer," Julia said. Wendy looked confused, so Julia added, "I've turned the house into a writer's retreat." The bald man narrowed his eyes at me. It suddenly struck me that if this was the man Zara had encountered at the chess club, there was a chance he knew I'd hired her, and Julia didn't know about that. We needed to get out of there before he let the cat out of that particular bag. "It must bring it all back," Wendy said, giving me a temporary reprieve. "I'm so sorry, Julia. I wish there was something we could do." "But there isn't," said Megan's granddad, still training his hostile gaze on me. "Let me show you out." We went back out to the car. Julia was fully deflated now. "I feel sick," she said. "Do you mind driving?" She handed me the keys, and I got into the driver's seat. "What's Megan's granddad's name?" I asked. "Do you know?" "Glyn Collins. Why?" "Oh, I just thought I recognised him, that's all." "He's well known around here," Julia said. "A pillar of the community. I remember he offered to take Michael out for a drink, introduce him to some of the other local men, but Michael wasn't into that kind of thing." "What do you mean?" "You know, men's clubs, groups of blokes who think women only have legs to get from the kitchen to the bedroom. Michael had his faults, but being a rampant misogynist wasn't one of them. Glyn asked him if he wanted to join the local chess club, and Michael went along to take a look, but said it wasn't his scene. Apart from a receptionist, there were no women, just a lot of old blokes. As we were about to drive off, something caught my eye. There was somebody in the upstairs window watching us, the teenage boy whose photo was on the mantelpiece. Julia followed my gaze. Oh, that's Jake, Megan's brother. He's very sweet. The boy stood up and pressed the tips of his fingers against the glass. It's been hard for Wendy, Julia said. Apparently, Jake has the mental age of a 5 or 6-year-old. A kind of Peter Pan. I guess that's one way of looking at it. Can we go home? Yes, of course, sorry. I raised my eyes to Jake once more. He was mouthing something, but I was unable to read his lips. He was pointing, too, at the woods beyond the house. I concentrated on his mouth, trying to figure out what he was saying. It looked like one word, over and over. It looked like Lily. And then, as I stared at him, he said another word. It looked like window. No, not window. Widow. He was saying widow. Chapter 23. Lily, 2014. Dad came into Lily's room and said 6 words that stabbed her in the heart with an icicle. Megan's granddad is taking you out. She stared at him. Nice of him, eh? Dad said. He called and said he was taking Megan to the adventure playground, and Megan asked if you could go too. He's going to pick you up in 15 minutes, so you better get a wriggle on and get dressed. He sighed as he rummaged through her chest of drawers. Goodness, Lily, it's a mess in your room. Where are your leggings? I feel sick, she said. I think I've got a temperature. He felt her forehead. You seem fine to me. Come on, don't be a malingerer. A what? Huffing and sighing, she dressed and waited for Megan and her granddad to arrive. As long as she stuck close to Megan, as long as she wasn't left alone with Mr. Collins, it should be okay. Mum had gone into Wrexham today because she had an appointment, so Dad was looking after her. As Lily brushed her hair, she tried to put her fear of Megan's granddad out of her mind, but that only freed up space for her other worries to creep into. Her worries about Mum and Dad. Mum seemed sad at the moment. She'd had a summer cold for weeks and complained about being tired all the time. Quite often Lily would walk into the room and Mum would be sitting there staring into space, and she wouldn't respond unless Lily said her name really loud or got right up in her face. Dad said she was a zombie, and Mum narrowed her eyes at him and said it was all his fault. Lily didn't know whose side to take. She didn't want to take anyone's side. She thought maybe her parents needed a date night, which was something Megan's mum and stepdad did, even though the thought of them kissing and being lovey-dovey made her want to vomit. But there was no one around to babysit. The whole thing was like horrible homework that the teacher hadn't explained properly. Megan and her granddad turned up and they went out. The 2 girls sat in the back seat, and Megan talked non-stop about her brother and YouTube and the Bloody Mary video game. Lily tuned out and concentrated on Mr. Collins. She could only see the back of his head and his eyes in the rearview mirror. He concentrated on driving, humming along with some rubbish old music on the radio. She relaxed until he said, "Everything all right, Lily?" He had caught her staring at him. Her ears burned and she shrank back into her seat, not speaking until they got to the adventure playground. The playground was massive. There was a chute slide and rope bridges strung between trees, and even a flying fox. Lily started to relax until a horrible boy who was part of a group of annoying kids who kept hogging the slide shoved her out of the way. "Hey!" When the boy reached the bottom of the slide, Megan's granddad went up and whispered something in his ear. The boy went white, and he kept out of Lily and Megan's way after that. Maybe Mr. Collins wasn't so bad after all. He bought them ice creams too, and slushies. Mum never let Lily drink slushies because she said they contained more E's than a rave party, whatever that meant. But Megan's granddad clearly wasn't one of those grown-ups who was obsessed with looking after your teeth. Back in the car, he said, "I need to go into town before I take you home, Lily. I've texted your dad, and he said it's fine." "Okay." As they approached Bedmore, Mr. Collins suddenly got this look in his eye, that I like scaring kids look, and said, "Did I ever tell you, girls, where the Red Widow came from?" Megan sat up. "No, tell us, Grandad." Lily shrank back in her seat. She really didn't want to hear it. "Lily, you'll be interested in this. Did you know your house is built on the site of an old slate mine?" She'd heard her parents talking about it before. Slate was basically a kind of rock. Once upon a very boring time, lots of people had spent their whole lives digging it up and using it to build roofs. Yes, Mr. Collins, she said. He grunted happily. That mine opened 200 years ago, you know. When you were a boy, said Megan. Very funny. Now, slate mining was a dangerous business. Lily's mind wandered off to something more interesting. Her attention drifted through the window and across the fields to her house, and, more specifically, her kitchen. What would it be tonight? She fancied burgers, or maybe pizza, or pasta. And he was crushed to death. Her attention snapped back to Mr. Collins. Terrible business, he said. And most terrible of all for David's wife. She was pregnant, and they say the shock made her lose her baby. He shook his head. The world was a cruel place back then, girls. None of the mollycoddling that goes on now. David's wife, whose name was Rhiannon, didn't just lose her baby. She lost her home. She was starving, alone, penniless, and now homeless. So she went to live under the bridge, Megan said. You told me that part before. Ah, but Lily hasn't heard the story. Megan frowned and nodded. She clearly took the story very seriously. Poor Rhiannon made a home under a bridge. She was a very pretty woman with all this black hair. One morning, a young man from the mine went down to the river and saw a dozen dead fish floating on the water, with Rhiannon standing by the bank. He ran back to tell the other men, and that's when they decided she must have killed the fish using witchcraft. And do you know what happened then? Megan's eyes were wide and round. The men formed a gang and drove her into the woods, she said. Exactly. They were going to burn her, but they were afraid to get too near. Instead, they banished her, thinking she'd die in the woods anyway. Were there wolves? Lily asked. No, they died out 400 years ago, but it was cold and inhospitable, and there was nothing to eat. He cleared his throat. They were almost in town now. As she headed into the woods, Rhiannon called out a curse. She said that if the townsfolk didn't bring her a child as a sacrifice, she would come into town and choose one. Do you know what happened next? Tell us, Grandad. Megan's voice had dropped to a whisper. Mr. Collins' eyes sparkled. The people ignored her warning, but a week later, something terrible happened. They had stopped at a traffic light, and he turned round in his seat, the seatbelt straining against his belly. The prettiest girl in the town disappeared. A girl as pretty as you two. She was 8 years old, out running an errand for her mother, and she never came home. The townsfolk searched the woods, and guess what they found? What, Grandad? A pile of bones at the foot of a tree. Among the bones was a necklace the pretty young girl had been wearing. Lily closed her eyes, imagining it. The girl's mum and dad, crying over the bones, crying and wishing they hadn't ignored the widow's demands. Mr. Collins showed his horrible teeth. The best part is, it's all true. Lily turned to look at Megan, expecting to exchange a smile about the scary but silly story, as if it were true. But Megan looked as serious as she did when their teacher told them important facts. They parked near the river, the same river where the witch had killed those fish, and Megan's granddad went into an old building, leaving the radio on for them. He came out 10 minutes later, and they saw him go into the bookshop next door. When he got back to the car, he handed each of them a paper bag. Inside each was the same book, Folk Tales and Urban Myths. You'll enjoy that, girls, he said. Right, Lily, we'd better get you home. Lily opened the book and immediately recoiled from a gruesome drawing of a werewolf munching on a sheep's belly. She snapped it shut. Next to her, Megan leafed through hers, exclaiming, Awesome, and oh my God! Lily looked up and saw Mr. Collins watching her in the rearview mirror. A shiver ran from her toes to the hair on her head, and she closed her eyes. She kept them shut all the way home. Chapter 24. The next morning, I worked on my novel for a couple of hours, although I found it hard to concentrate. I spent more time staring out the window than I did looking at the screen. My mind kept returning to what I'd seen at Megan's house. Her brother Jake, pointing towards the woods. The same woods I was staring at now. Widow. My mind flashed back to the time I'd explored the woods and found that strange little hut. There had been a soft toy inside, hadn't there? At the time, I hadn't even known about Lily's disappearance, so I hadn't thought anything of it. I knew now that Lily's soft toy big cat had been found in the river, but had someone abducted her, kept her there in that hut and given her a toy to pacify her? It didn't quite add up, because surely the police must have checked that hut. But I could no longer work. I was compelled to go and have another look. It took 30 minutes to retrace my steps and locate the clearing and the stone hut. A group of magpies hopped about in the long, damp grass, chattering to one another. A light drizzle soaked my clothes and face, the weather so dismal it was actually a relief to take shelter in the grim, litter-strewn interior of the hut. I had forgotten how dilapidated it was. The door was rotten and the windows smashed. Not a great place to keep a child prisoner, although the abductor could have tied or chained her up. I could imagine local teenagers coming here to take drugs or have sex, or both, although the creepiness of the place might deter them. The image of a little girl sitting here shivering with fear and cold played out in my mind. The soft toy was nowhere to be seen. I poked at the litter with my shoe. I was sure it had been in this spot beside the bench. Had someone been back and taken it? If someone had abducted Lily and kept her in this hut, surely they wouldn't have been foolish enough to leave a toy here in the first place. The likelihood was that it had been here for many years. Perhaps a visiting teenager had taken it, or chucked it outside. Maybe a dog had been in and carried it off. There were multiple possible explanations, all of which had nothing to do with Lily. Disappointed, I left the hut, and glimpsed a figure on the far side of the field, directly opposite the spot where I'd entered the clearing. Beyond this field was another part of the woods. The person vanished into the trees. They had been wearing a red coat. Ursula? What was she doing out here? I hurried across the field, scaring the magpies, which scattered and flew towards high branches. I counted them. 7. How did the rhyme go? 7 for a secret, never to be told. Not the most auspicious sign. I reached the spot where I'd seen Ursula vanish into the trees. She was probably just out for a walk, exploring the area. Or maybe, I thought sarcastically, her spirit guide was leading her. It still seemed odd, though, that she would come out here in the drizzle so far from the house. I couldn't resist the urge to follow and see what she was up to. I headed into the woods after her. I could see her in her red coat just up ahead, walking unhurriedly along the path. She had her back to me and hadn't seen me as far as I could tell. She had her hood up to protect her from the rain, and she held out a hand, touching the trunks of trees as she passed. Perhaps she was communing with them. The path forked ahead of her and she swerved left. I followed, but found myself confronted by a huge puddle of black mud. I skirted around it. As I trod back onto the path, I realized I'd lost sight of her. I increased my pace and turned left at the fork. There she was, heading into a thick tangle of vegetation, pushing through sideways away from the path. That seemed like a strange thing to do. Had she spotted something on the other side? The bushes obscured her, and I hung back for a second before following. Brambles clawed at my coat, and a wren popped out of the bushes, startling me. I made an "ah" sound, my voice shattering the peace of the woods. Ursula must have heard me, but she didn't stop moving. I hurried to catch up, wondering why she didn't stop to wait for me. It was as if she were trying to get away. I glimpsed her red coat through the trees ahead, then she disappeared behind another wall of vegetation. I jogged along the path to the spot where I'd last seen her. She had vanished. I walked quickly up the path, which branched off in 3 directions, checking the ground for footprints, but found nothing. The ground was harder and drier here beneath the canopy formed by the trees. I chose the middle path and walked for another few minutes. There was no sound except birdsong, and now I was at a dead end, formed of impassable blackberry bushes. I swore out loud. I'd lost her. Chapter 25. On my way back to Nithe Bran, I thought more about our visit to Megan's house and what Jake had been trying to tell us. I needed to talk to him and had an idea about how this could be achieved. Remembering the route Julia had taken to his house, I changed direction and followed the road towards the estate where Jake and Megan lived. I hoped Jake's mum, Wendy, would be amenable. Julia had told me that after her divorce, Wendy had started using her maiden name, Collins, again. She had a new partner now, and the kid's dad lived in another part of the country. "It was a painful divorce," Julia had said. "He was a bastard. I think he used to hit her. I heard that Glyn found out and threatened him, told him if he wanted to keep possession of his balls he'd better leave town. Glyn's a hard man. Yeah, plus he knows a lot of people." After that first visit to the Collins house, I'd looked Glyn up on Google. He matched Zara's description of the man she'd met at the chess club, the one who'd made her and Malcolm Jones so uneasy. Of course, there were plenty of men around with bald heads and bad teeth, but I had a strong feeling it was him, and thought it shouldn't be hard to confirm. I just needed to check if he was a member of the chess club. There was very little information about him online. There was an article from the local newspaper about he and a group of handymen had rebuilt a widow's cottage after it suffered heavy storm damage. Another news story told how he'd helped raise money for the local historical society, along with one Malcolm Jones. There had been talk of opening a museum to teach visitors about the disused mine, but nothing had come of it. And there was an old story about how he had coached the local girls' football team and got them to the final of a regional competition. There he was, in black and white, holding his runner-up medal, surrounded by grinning, muddy girls who would be grown up now. As Julia had said, Glyn Collins was a pillar of the community. I had only encountered him briefly, but in some ways he reminded me of my dad, a typical bluff Welsh bloke, a man's man, good with his hands, keen on sport and tradition. I was hoping he wouldn't be at his daughter's house now, but as soon as I turned the corner onto the estate, I saw him. He was standing in the front garden, smoking. I hesitated, wondering if I should come back another time, but it was too late. He'd spotted me. I crossed the road, watching as he discarded his cigarette and folded his arms, doing a good impression of a nightclub bouncer protecting his door. "Mr. Collins," I said, "we met yesterday." He nodded. "I was hoping—" The way he was looking at me, like I was a rat that had strayed onto his property, made me lose the thread of what I was trying to say. "I wanted to have a little chat with Jake." He took a step towards me. It was a classic, intimidating manoeuvre. But I wasn't scared of him. He was, 25 years older than me? Maybe more. "You are David's son," he said. I was momentarily taken aback, but it made sense. Glyn knew everybody in Bedmawr, past and present. He must have been asking around about me, which was interesting. Who'd he spoken to? Shirley, at the Apple Tree B&B? That's right, I said, expecting him to ask after my dad, bracing myself to deliver the news I hated saying. But instead, Glyn said, "What do you want with Jake?" "I'm writing a book," I said, "in which some of the characters are teenagers. I need to talk to a couple of teenagers about the language they use, the slang, and so on." This was the line I'd planned to use on Wendy. "Jake's not an ordinary teenager," Glyn said. "Oh, I know that, but—" "The answer's no." "Mr. Collins, please." I caught a movement above us and looked up. Jake was at his window again, staring down at his granddad and me with saucer eyes. Glyn saw and flapped a meaty hand at his grandson, telling him to get back. Jake gawped at me one last time, then retreated into the shadows. "Like teenage boys, do you?" Glyn said. His question was so unexpected that I didn't know what to say for a few seconds. "What? Of course not." "Maybe the papers would like to hear about it. Our famous writer has been harassing a young boy with learning difficulties." "That's ridiculous." "You just asked me if you could sneak up to his bedroom." I stared at him. There was no use arguing. "Fine. I'll find some other teenagers to talk to for my book." I turned away. "You do that." He raised his voice as I walked back across the road, just as a middle-aged couple came out of the nearest house. Glyn shouted, "Stay away from my grandchildren, pervert!" The couple's eyes almost popped out of their heads as I hurried away, burning with anger and embarrassment. Back in my room at Nithe Bran, I finally calmed down enough to think about my encounter with Glyn rationally. Was he simply being protective of his family? No, I was sure there was more to it. I remembered how on edge Zara had seemed after her encounter with him. Maybe it was just that he was an unpleasant arsehole. But I wanted to know more about him. I opened Skype and called my mum. She answered straight away. "Darling, how lovely to hear from you, twice in 1 month. I've got another question for you about the old days," I said. "Do you remember a guy called Glyn Collins?" "Oh, yes." All the warmth left her voice. "Why are you asking about him?" "I met him recently. It sounds like you don't think much of him." She moved her head, and sunshine flooded the screen. It was raining again here in Wales, and the temptation to fly out to Spain and join her fluttered through my mind. "No," Mum said, her voice clipped. "I was never very keen on him." "Why not?" It was always a struggle to get my mother to say a bad word about anyone. "Did he do something to you?" "Oh, no, he never did anything to me. Not directly, anyway. He's just, well, we used to call them male chauvinist pigs in my day. He was proud of it. He was awful to his wife, Nerys, God rest her soul. He was cruel, too, hard." "He seems to dote on his grandchildren," I said. "And he looks after Wendy, his daughter." Maybe he softened with age, but 40 years ago, if someone in town had a litter of kittens they didn't want, they'd bring them to Glyn Collins. He was always happy to drown them." "Lovely. What did Dad think of him?" She frowned. "He was friendly with him. They were part of the Bedmawr Historical Society." She snorted. "Just a bunch of blokes meeting in the pub and talking about the good old days, as far as I could tell." "Was Malcolm Jones part of the Historical Society too?" "Yes, he was the chairman, although I was never sure why such a small group needed a chairman." "Did you hear that he died?" On screen, my mum's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, no. How did that happen? When?" "A heart attack, just over a week ago." "Oh, dear, how dreadful. This is going to start happening more and more as I get older." I remembered someone else I'd encountered recently. Sorry, one more person. Shirley, damn, I don't know her surname. She runs a B&B, the Apple Tree." "Shirley Roberts," she grimaced. "Didn't you like her either?" Mum ignored the question, probably because she didn't want to admit it. "How on earth did you meet her?" It's a long story. But was she part of this historical society?" "Oh, goodness, no. Glyn wouldn't let any women join. I told you, he was a chauvinist pig. I think he got her to do some secretarial work, though. In fact, there were rumours he was bonking her behind his wife's back." She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. "Oh, goodness me, Lucas, this was all a long time ago." She went quiet for a minute, and I hoped I wasn't bringing back painful memories. "There was another guy who was part of that group. Oh, what was his name?" She tapped the side of her head. "Albert, that was it. Albert Patterson." "Oh, what is it?" "Albert lived in the house where you're staying, Nath Bran." "Really? Hang on, Mum. Wait there." I left the room and ran down the stairs and into the Thomas room. I scoured the bookcase and found what I was looking for, the battered edition of The Owl and the Pussycat. I pulled out the Polaroid showing the American Gothic-style couple and ran back upstairs. I held the photo up to the camera. "Is this Albert?" Mum went off to fetch her glasses and peered at the screen. "Yes, that's him. He was a nice chap. I never understood why he hung around with Glyn Collins. He and Bethan were a sweet couple. They were older than us, no kids. I was always envious of them for living in such a lovely big house and having all that freedom. I wonder what happened to them." Julia had told me she'd bought the house from a children's charity. I guessed Albert and his wife must have died, and, having no family, left the place to charity. "I feel very sad about Malcolm," my mum said. "I wonder if they've had the funeral yet. I must send flowers." "Hang on." I went onto the local newspaper website, the same one I've been reading about Glyn Collins on, and clicked through to the births, marriages and deaths section. There it was, the death announcement for Malcolm Jones, beloved father of Ollie. "It's today," I said. "This afternoon." "Oh, I've left it too late." "Maybe I could take some flowers along on your behalf." "Would you? That would be very kind." "Oh, no problem." I said goodbye and ended the call. I had an ulterior motive for going, of course. I was quite sure Glyn Collins would be there. It would give me another chance to get a good look at him, because the more I heard about him, the more convinced I became that he was hiding something. Chapter 26. The funeral was at St Mary's Church near the centre of town, close to the chess club and the library. I hadn't brought any smart clothes with me, not imagining I'd need them, so I popped into one of the few men's clothes shops in Bedmawr and bought a black suit off the peg. It wasn't exactly stylish, but it would do. Next, I bought some flowers from the florist next door and wrote a message from my mum and myself. Malcolm's family weren't to know I'd never met him. Noticing a phone shop across the street, I went in and bought a new iPhone, activating it straight away and then logging into my Apple account to sync my contacts, emails, etc. 10 minutes later, I shook off my umbrella and crept into the church, laying the flowers with the others. I sat in a pew near the back. Nobody noticed me. Well over 100 people had turned up, many of them Malcolm's age, but quite a few younger people too. I guess they'd once been schoolchildren who he'd inspired through his job as a librarian. I couldn't see Glyn Collins. He was probably near the front. The service started, the pallbearers carrying the coffin down the aisle. There was Ollie Jones, Malcolm's taxi-driving son, sitting next to his girlfriend, Heleth. Her mother, Shirley, was just behind them. When I'd met Heleth at the B&B, I'd been struck by her good looks. Now, seeing her and Ollie together, I realised what a mismatched couple they were. He was punching well above his weight, which made me think about that limited dating pool again. In a larger town or city, Heleth wouldn't be going out with an ordinary-looking taxi driver. She would be... I stopped myself. Why was I being so uncharitable? Ollie must have hidden depths, a spark I hadn't witnessed yet, and the poor sod had just lost his dad. It was an emotional ceremony. The vicar spoke warmly about Malcolm and his contribution to the community. Ollie got up and read out a eulogy, stopping every few sentences to take a deep, shuddering breath. Afterwards, Heleth leaned her head on his shoulder. I learned from the lady sitting beside me that after this service, the coffin was being taken to the crematorium. "He wanted his ashes to be scattered in his garden," she said, "among the daffs and crocuses." The service ended. I made my way outside and was pleased to find the rain had stopped. I wasn't sure what to do, but the lady I'd sat next to told me I should come to the wake, which was taking place at Ollie's house. "All are welcome," she said. An hour and a half later, I found myself among a crowd of people, explaining who I was and why I was at the funeral. Malcolm's wife had died a few years before, but most of the older people remembered my parents and were touched that I'd come along to represent them. Most of them were fascinated to hear about their move to Spain and to learn that I was a novelist, and I found myself chatting to a group of retired women who wanted to know where I got my ideas from. I spotted the shining dome of Glyn's head through the crowd. He was talking to another man his age, laughing heartily at something the other guy was saying. Was this another member of the Historical Society? I hung back. I wasn't sure what I was going to say to him. Why was Malcolm scared of you? Why didn't you want me to talk to Jake? A scenario played out in my head. Glyn lurking by the river on that fateful New Year's Day 2 years ago, snatching Lily when her parents were out of sight and throwing her toy cat into the water, taking her somewhere into the woods, hiding her in that hut, doing things to her that I didn't want to picture, killing her and burying her, his granddaughter's best friend in the woods. But what evidence did I have for any of this? I quickly ran through it again. Zara had reported that this man made Malcolm seem afraid while she was quizzing him about Lily's disappearance. The next day, Malcolm died before he could tell Zara any more. It had been a heart attack, but if his heart was weak, perhaps he'd been frightened to death, if such a thing was possible. And in this scenario, Jake had seen or heard something, which was why Glyn didn't want anyone talking to him. What could it have been? A conversation he'd eavesdropped on. Had Jake actually seen Glyn with Lily? Perhaps he witnessed something that happened before Lily's disappearance, during one of the many times Lily had visited the house. I could go to the police with my suspicions, but it seemed extremely unlikely there would be any evidence. Even if the police talked to Jake and he told them something incriminating, it would be easy for Glyn to deny it. How likely were the police to believe the word of a teenage boy with learning difficulties? As I thought it through, I realized I was getting way ahead of myself, my imagination running away with me as usual. To go to the police now with my half-baked theories would be liable to cause nothing but upset to Jake and his family, and if Glyn was guilty of something, he would be put on high alert. I needed to wait, to find out more. I found myself staring at Glyn, and at that moment the crowd between us shifted and he saw me. He stared back, clearly shocked I was here, shocked and angry. He was about to head over, fists clenched, and I braced myself for a confrontation, when a woman in her 50s stepped into his path and started talking to him. The woman had a cleavage that pinned Glynn to the spot. At the same moment, someone tapped me on the shoulder. "Lucas, I didn't expect to see you here." It was Shirley. She was dressed all in black with a fascinator attached to her head. I couldn't help but stare at it. She had a sherry glass in her hand. "I'm happy to see you," I said. "Can we talk?" "What about?" She touched the cross around her neck, just as she had the first time we met. She was nervous, and the way she glanced over her shoulder at Glynn told me all I needed to know. She, like Malcolm, was afraid of him. Jostled by mourners moving through the hallway and aware of Glynn's proximity, I said, "Maybe now's not the best time or place. Could I pop round to the apple tree later, when this is all over?" She hesitated, eyes flicking to Glynn once again. He was still talking to the chest of the woman with the cleavage. "You look so much like your father," Shirley said. "When he was your age." "Is that a good thing?" She smiled girlishly. "Come round at tea time." She took a sip of her sherry. "I'd better not have too many of these." Heleth appeared by her side. "Yes, go easy, Mum." She smiled at me. "Nice of you to come. Hope you're not going to put us all in a book." "Ah, you found out what I do for a living." "Ollie told me how he'd helped a stranded novelist, and I put two and two together. He said you were going to give him a copy of your book." "Oh, yes, I think I said I'd give him one if he promised to read it." Heleth laughed. "I've never known him read anything longer than a text message, but I'd love to read it if you want to drop a copy off at the B&B. I was about to explain that I didn't have any books with me in Wales, but she was already steering Shirley away. "Come on, Mum, the buffet's open. Let's get you something to eat." As they stepped out of my path, I saw that Glynn had vanished, and it was time for me to make a move too. I bumped into Ollie by the front door. "Sorry for your loss," I said. "My parents were friends with your dad, so I'm here on their behalf. Hope that's okay." "Yeah, of course. Thanks for coming." He gave me a weak smile. "Not got lost again recently, I hope?" His eyes were red, and he looked over my shoulder before I could come up with a response. "Have you seen Heleth?" "She was, taking her mum to check out the buffet." "Huh. Sounds right." He went to move away, then stopped, leaning forward and blasting me with his warm, beery breath. "You family did the right thing, leaving this town," he said. He disappeared into the crowd. I stood outside in the rain. I was desperate to talk to Zara. I wanted to go over the conversation she'd had with Malcolm again and run my suspicions, I hesitated to call it a theory, past her. There was no one else I could talk to, and I needed to know if the whole thing sounded insane. Once again I tried calling her mobile and her office number. There was no reply. I checked the time. It was 3 o'clock. Telford, where Zara was based, was only an hour away by car. I could drive there, talk to her, and be back in time to see Shirley. The day was already a complete write-off work-wise. Fired up and eager to keep up momentum, I hurried back to my car. The road to Telford was picturesque, and traffic was light. The rain had slowed to a light patter. A few months ago I'd watched a documentary about the so-called Shropshire Viper, a serial killer who'd terrorised this part of the world, waking up the county for a while. Now it had slipped back to sleep. I hit the M54 outside Telford and followed my sat-nav's instructions to Zara's office. It was located in an office block which housed half a dozen businesses. Like everything in this new town, it was a modern building with little character, function over form. I parked in the small car park round the back and pressed Zara's buzzer. There was no reply. Perhaps I shouldn't have expected anything else. After all, she wasn't answering her office phone, so why did I think she'd be there? It was so frustrating, though, and as I stood in the rain, I thumped my fist against the door, cursing my wasted journey. "Hey, you'll break that door!" A young woman with curly blonde hair approached the building, a scowl on her face. "Who are you? What are you doing?" Sorry, I'm trying to get hold of Zara Sullivan." The woman was carrying a leather briefcase. I assumed she worked in the building. "The private detective? I haven't seen her for ages." My mouth went dry. "Really? How long?" A couple of weeks at least. I rent the office next door to hers. She narrowed her eyes. You're not a debt collector, are you? I'm a client. She gave me the once-over, then said, Come inside a minute. I'm getting soaked out here. In the lobby, she introduced herself as Samantha and said, I'm sure it was 2 weeks ago. She told me she was off to see someone in Wales about a case. She seemed excited. She's been struggling to find clients recently. She winced, as if she realised how indiscreet she was being. I'm the person she was going to see in Wales, I said. She told me she was coming back. That was just over a week ago. Well, she definitely hasn't been back to the office. She chewed a fingernail. Oh, blimey, you've got me all worried now. I was worried too. Do you know where she lives? Yeah, she lives with a bloke in Oakengates. A boyfriend? That was surprising. Samantha laughed. No, he's her GBF. I must have looked puzzled because she said, Gay best friend. Hang on. I've got the address here. She took out her mobile and looked it up. I copied it into my new phone and thanked her, promising to get Zara to contact her as soon as I found her. It took only 15 minutes to get to Oakengates and find the address. Another modern building, this one divided into flats. I pressed the button on the intercom labelled Zara Sullivan and Dan Kay, and a man answered, Zara's GBF. I explained that I was looking for his flatmate, and he buzzed me up. He was a short guy, good-looking with a shaved head. Zara's in Tenerife, he said. Are you sure? He raised an eyebrow. Are you a debt collector? I was offended. Did I really look like a debt collector? But the fact 2 people had asked me made me think that Zara must be in some financial difficulty. I told him the same thing I'd told Samantha. She emailed me a week ago to say she'd binned the case she was working on and had decided to get some sun. She didn't phone you? He shook his head. Didn't you think that was strange? Does she normally email you to tell you things? Has she suddenly taken off on holiday before? Yeah, she has actually. Although the email thing is a bit weird. She usually calls. He smiled. She is quite fond of her own voice. Something was definitely wrong. Would Zara have really gone straight from Bedmawr, having abandoned the investigation without telling me, to Tenerife, without even calling home to pick up a swimsuit? She'd had to have come close to Telford to get to the nearest airport. Has she updated Facebook or anything with holiday snaps? I asked. She doesn't use social media, Dan replied. If she went abroad without coming back here, she must have had her passport with her in Wales. Does she usually carry her passport around with her? Do you know where she keeps it? Can you— He held up his hands as if warding off an attack. Whoa, give me a chance. Sorry. He seemed exasperated. Look, I don't know anything about a passport, and I have no idea if you're really who you say you are. I'm not a debt collector. Please, shut up. I'm not going to answer any more of your questions. I'm happy to pass a message on, but that's it. But goodbye. He shut the door in my face. On the way back to my car, I called Edward Rooney, who'd originally put me in touch with Zara. Once again, I explained what I knew, adding what Dan had just told me. Is there any way you can check if her passport has been used? I asked. He blew air into the phone. Only the police can do that, and they won't take this seriously. She's a grown woman who emailed her flatmate to say she's going on holiday. You've got absolutely no evidence of foul play. But don't you think it seems weird? I could picture him shrugging. I expect she's gone off to the Canaries. Can't say I blame her. I'd offered to relieve you of some of your money and look into it. Fly out to Tenerife to track her down. But I'm in the middle of a bastard of a case right now. My advice? Stop worrying and finish that bloody book, okay? I hung up. It was just after 5. If I didn't get a move on, I'd be late for my rendezvous with Shirley. Chapter 27. I hit rush hour traffic coming out of Telford. I was hardly in a state to drive, unable to concentrate adequately on the road. I pulled into a roundabout too early, narrowly avoiding a collision with a BMW, the driver leaning on his horn and gesturing furiously as adrenaline flooded my system. I parked outside the bed and breakfast and paused before getting out of the car. Black rain clouds obscured the sun, sucking all the colour from the street, but it was dark inside the house. Had Shirley and Heleth not come home? I rang the bell. The dog barked and ran up to the door, scrabbling at the wood as if it was desperate to get out. I searched my memory banks for its name. Oscar, that was it. I pushed the letterbox open and said the dog's name, but that made him bark more. I peered through into the gloom. Oscar dashed up and down the hallway, a frantic ball of fur, yapping and making a strangled, growling sound in his throat. It looked like Shirley had left him longer than expected, and he was desperate for the toilet or food, or both. I murmured soothing words, crouched by the door, but it didn't do any good. He grew increasingly frantic, then suddenly vanished from sight. I squinted through the letterbox, searching him out, and as my eyes grew accustomed to the poor light, a shape came into focus at the bottom of the staircase. It looked like a body. Oh, fuck. I grabbed the phone from my pocket and turned the flashlight on, shining it through the narrow gap. The hallway lit up, light bouncing off the walls. There, lying on her side beneath a framed painting of Christ, was Shirley. One arm was stretched out above her head, and there was a pool of something dark spreading out across the floorboards. Blood. I called the police. Bedmawr was too small, in this era of stringent budgets and cuts to public services, to have its own police station, so they had to come from Wrexham. It took 30 minutes, during which time Oscar grew increasingly desperate to get out. I continued to talk to him through the letterbox. His yapping had drawn a number of neighbours from their houses, including a middle-aged man from next door. He was overweight, with florid cheeks and no neck, and moaned about the dog, saying it was drowning out the TV. "Passed out drunk, has she?" he said. "I saw her come home earlier, drunk as a skunk she was. That thing she had on her head was falling off. She could hardly walk." "Was she on her own?" I asked. "As far as I could tell." A pair of cops arrived, followed by an ambulance. A police officer with ginger hair looked through into the hallway, then broke a window to gain access, asking me and the neighbours to keep back. As soon as he opened the door, Oscar came pelting out, spinning in circles as he entered the street, barking and growling. I grabbed his collar and scooped him up, cradling him like a baby, feeling his heart thudding against my palm. As the police entered the house, I could see a trail of bloody paw prints between Shirley's prone figure and the doormat. The paramedics went in and shut the door as a crowd gathered on the pavement. I waited with them, still holding Oscar, who'd calmed down now. "Poor little mate," a grey-haired woman said, offering to take him until Heleth got home, explaining that she lived across the street. I handed him over. "Oh, dear," said the woman. I followed her gaze. There were smears of blood on the front of my coat, transferred from the dog's paws. "I wonder where Heleth is," I said. "Probably with that boyfriend of hers." There was disapproval in the woman's voice, as if Ollie were a criminal rather than the son of an esteemed librarian. "Don't you like Ollie?" I asked. She seemed surprised that I'd picked up on her tone. "I don't know much about him, except he was a bit of a tearaway at school. His dad, Malcolm, was very disappointed he didn't go off to college and ended up driving a taxi. Kids." It was funny, hearing her refer to a 40-something man as a kid. "Anyway, I'd better get this dog inside." She hurried off across the road. The other neighbour was telling the policeman who guarded the door about how Shirley had come home inebriated. I heard someone else mutter that she liked to drink. I knew exactly what was going to happen. Everyone would assume she'd fallen down the stairs, pissed, an unfortunate accident, because nobody else could see the pattern. The door opened, and the paramedics carried Shirley out, zipped into a body bag. The ginger police officer followed them, and as they reached the pavement, somebody rushed past me, shoes clacking on the asphalt. It was Heleth, hurrying across from where she'd parked her car. She stepped in front of the paramedics, eyes darting between her house and the body bag. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cracking. She took a step towards her house, stopped, and turned back towards the zipped-up body. The police officer tried to calm her down, taking her arm and guiding her away while the paramedics carried Shirley into the ambulance. The policeman said something to Heleth that I couldn't hear, and she went stiff. A second later, she crumpled to the ground, and the paramedics returned and knelt beside her. She was only out for a moment. Then she sat up, looking bewildered. The rubberneckers, who'd been on the verge of dispersing, crowded around them. It was probably the most exciting thing that had happened around here for a long time. The red-haired police officer was stood a little way from where Heleth lay, scratching his head. I approached him and told him my name. "Somebody pushed her down those stairs," I said. He regarded me with weary scepticism. "What makes you say that?" I opened my mouth. shut it again. It's complicated. Well, it looks like an accident to me. Tell me what you saw. He made notes as I detailed what I'd found. But when it came to explaining why I thought someone had pushed her, I couldn't do it. I knew how crazy it sounded. I knew how easily my argument could be countered. Malcolm had a heart attack. Zara's gone off on holiday. Shirley got drunk and had an accident. There was no pattern, just unconnected events. There was nothing sinister here. I would be wasting my breath. I watched the ambulance go, taking Shirley and Heleth with it. As I headed back to my car, I felt eyes on the back of my neck. I turned. There was no one there. Chapter 28. The others were eating dinner when I arrived back at the retreat. Max was next to Susie with Ursula opposite. I watched them from the doorway for a minute. They were too absorbed in a verbal game of tennis to notice me. Max and Ursula bashed the conversation back and forth while Susie watched them. I was desperate to talk to someone, but could I take any of my fellow writers into my confidence? I didn't trust Max. Ursula would probably try to tell me an evil spirit was responsible. And as for Susie, well, I still wasn't sure about her relationship with Max. That left Julia, but the thought of telling her I'd hired a private detective to investigate Lily's disappearance and informing her that the detective hadn't found anything concrete filled me with dread. On the other hand, I felt closer to her again after the sighting of Megan and the trip to her house. Surely Julia would understand my intentions were good and that I'd kept it from her because I didn't want her to get her hopes up. The truth was, I had no idea how she would react. But I made up my mind. I owed it to her to tell her and to stop keeping secrets. And maybe, just maybe, she could help me figure it all out. Hello. I didn't see you sneak in. I whirled round. Julia. Sorry. Didn't mean to make you jump. Do you want dinner? I floundered, which made her laugh. It's all right. You don't have to answer straight away. Oh, I've got something for you. I followed her into the kitchen, where she opened a drawer and fished out a small object. It was the pen Priya had given me. I turned it over in my hands, relief washing over me. I'd convinced myself that I'd lost it. I was tempted to kiss it. I looked up to see Julia smiling at me. Why is it so special? She asked. Because of who gave it to me. Oh? Julia didn't know about Priya. Since arriving at the retreat, I hadn't found an opportunity to bring it up, to let her know we had something awful in common, without it seeming as if I was saying, me too. Now was the perfect time to tell her, but first I asked, where did you find it? She hesitated. Do you promise not to cause a scene? What? Did someone have it? Was it Ursula? She sighed. Calm down, Lucas. No, it wasn't Ursula. I found it in Max's room. What? When I was changing the bedding, under the pillow. Before I could get angry, she hurriedly said, I already asked him about it. He said he had no idea what it was doing there. He thinks he might have picked it up by mistake the night Ursula arrived. He said he has a couple of similar pens. But why was it under his pillow? Also, I'm sure I didn't take it out of my room. You're not 100% sure, though, are you? I rubbed my forehead. I was mentally exhausted, still shocked by what had happened to Shirley, and Zara's absence was playing on my mind. No, I suppose it's possible I brought it downstairs, but what about my phone? I'm sure someone was in my room that night. Julia tilted her head. What? You didn't tell me about that? I rubbed my forehead. I was getting confused, forgetting that although I'd told Julia about my things going missing, only Susie knew about my nocturnal intruder. Lucas, are you okay? You look shattered. She touched my upper arm and her hand lingered there. It was warm. I had the urge to pull her closer, to kiss her, take her to bed and lose myself in her. In that moment, despite the exhaustion that threatened to suck me under, there was nothing else I would rather do. And I was sure, from the way she was looking at me and how she didn't remove her hand, that she could feel it. The air between us was thick, heavy with unspoken words. I lay my hand on top of hers, held her palm against my triceps. Max came through the door. Oops, he said. Didn't mean to interrupt. Julia snatched her hand away. Max saw the pen in my hand. Sorry about the weird mistake, old chap. I'm always picking up other people's pens. Terrible habit. Everything that had happened today, All the stress, including the shattered sexual tension, it combined to make the room lurch around me. I pointed a finger at Max. "You took it, you arsehole. You came into my room and stole it." He stared at me. "I bet you've got my phone too, haven't you? Come on, tell me, where is it?" "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." "Have you been going through it?" I jabbed a finger at him, trying to find something you could use against me. "Oh, Jesus. I bet it was you who told Ursula about Priya. You fucking arsehole." Out of the corner of my eye, through a pinkish mist, I could see Julia, her mouth open with shock. "You're a jealous, snobbish, has-been loser," I spat.